Distinguished guests, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Royal Danish Academy of Sciences and Letters, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to this lecture, not least our distinguished speaker, Professor William Labov, a legend in linguistics. Labov's work will be presented by a colleague here in Denmark, Professor Frans Gregersen, in a few moments. But first, it's my privilege to introduce the lecture and the series of lectures more generally. William Labov actually inaugurates a new series of public lectures hosted by the Royal Danish Academy, which we've been able to realize thanks to the generosity of the Carlsberg Foundation, a foundation that has contributed invaluably to the growth and integrity of research in Denmark. This series is dedicated to the humanities and social sciences, and our hope is that it will contribute both to a deeper understanding of the development of particular fields of research and convey a sense of the kind of commitment it takes to address the complex enigmas of human and social life and transform it to universal knowledge. In the humanities and the social sciences, the objects of study are also subjects, and this gives research a particular twist, as we shall see, I think, challenging the researcher at a very personal level. So with this series, we have wanted to open a window to particular trajectories of research in this intersubjective domain. In the Academy, we have the privilege of regularly meeting colleagues and hearing about frontier research in all academic disciplines. And we would like to share this experience with a larger audience, such as this audience. And in this series in particular, we have wanted to highlight the many roads towards new knowledge on the human side of things. Since its inauguration in 1742, the Royal Danish Academy has had as its main objective to contribute to the promotion of basic research in the general interest of advancing knowledge for the benefit of society. In the age of the European Enlightenment, when the Academy was founded, science and knowledge were seen as universal means to social progress and new human freedoms. It was an era where serious mapping and classification of continents, plants, animals, human races, languages, and much more became professionalized. And it was actually part of the statutes of the Academy that it should contribute to such detailed mapping. Since the Academy's infancy, the perception of the world has changed considerably, as no one will doubt, and it has become clear that neither progress nor freedom is easily achieved. But there is a general consensus about the necessity of keeping some kind of Enlightenment paradigm alive, if more pragmatic and less ideological than in the 18th century. Knowledge still makes a difference, and we are still seeking to bring some order to the world. Thus, while we are here celebrating an individual scholar who deserves our unreserved recognition, we are also honoring generations of scholars who have contributed to our knowledge of who we are as humans and as members of diverse communities. Before I leave the floor to Frans Gregersen, I would want to share with you a tiny piece of Enlightenment knowledge that may serve as a sounding board for the lecture to follow. In 1733, the heyday of the Enlightenment quest for universal science, a certain John Arbuthnot, who was a Scottish physician and polymath, as well as a well-known satirical writer at the time, and also a member of the Royal Society in Britain, published a serious essay concerning the effects of air on human bodies. European traders had begun traveling widely at the time, and scientists worked hard at classifying the diverse peoples and their natural surroundings. The emerging comparative knowledge made a new kind of generalization possible, as Arbuthnot sought to demonstrate. So he suggested that the different climates of various nations stimulated different activities. Thus, mathematicians, philosophers, and mechanics would tend to arise in a nation with a climate like the British, while painters, statuaries, architects, and poets, which besides the rules of art demand imagination, and I quote him here, would predominantly come from warmer places. In other words, the climatic conditions of the north, and we are part of that, I'm sorry to say, apparently stimulated reflection and and mental awareness, whereas the balmier climes of the Mediterranean resulted in passion and imagination. The main reason to mention Arbuthnot here is a connected proposition that he also made, namely that the variations in language could also be ascribed to climatic differences. He wrote, "The serrated, close way of speaking of northern nations may be owing to their reluctance to open their mouth wide in the cold air, which must make their language abound in consonants. Whereas from a contrary cause, the inhabitants of warmer climates opening their mouths must form a softer language abounding in vowels." So these linguistic peculiarities apparently also made the Northerners prone to more inward pursuits, philosophizing and mathematizing, I couldn't say it, while the Southerners would engage in more expressive pursuits such as painting and architecture. This observation actually is a very early attempt to understand the causes of linguistic variation, with some, if slight, empirical backing. As we shall shortly be hearing about linguistic variation in America by the author of the Atlas of North American English, we may sense a degree of continuity between the Enlightenment quest for precise maps and present concerns. Meanwhile, I think we'll also get a vivid sense of methodological progress, including the important recognition of the sociality of language practices, which was still far away in Arbuthnot's essay. With these few words, I shall congratulate today's speaker and emphasize that we could not have wished for a more appropriate first speaker in this series. A man of words, indeed, and of eminent scholarship. We are deeply honored that you accepted the invitation to share some of your reflections on your work with this highly dedicated audience of scholars, students, and professionals. And we are looking very much forward to hearing your lecture on the human side of linguistic variation. But first, I shall leave the floor to Frans Gregersen, who will introduce our speaker more thoroughly. Thank you and welcome.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Frans Gregersen, but that is immaterial. I'm only here to introduce this evening's featured speaker and the reason why so many have come from near and far, William Labov. It is indeed a rare honor and the perfect privilege for me to introduce a man whose accomplishments are innumerable like the stars and whose influence within his chosen field of study is as great as that of the moon on the tide. William Labov was originally trained as an engineer. He became a specialist in inks until he decided to change his course and started to study linguistics. He is thus a great proof of the often quoted observation that outsiders often renew disciplines when they become insiders. Labov studied at Columbia University with the great Uriel Weinreich, who was himself a bit of a legend, a wunderkind who single-handedly forged anew, if not founded, the study of language contact. Labov's MA thesis was about a small community which had become a tourist island, Martha's Vineyard, and this study is still quoted and universally admired, and has actually been replicated, I believe, twice since then. The originality of the Martha's Vineyard study lies not only in its detailed analysis of what phonetic differences are determined by and used for, but also in its vigorous attempt to explain the intricate structures revealed by having recourse to the interaction of social and linguistic patterns. But it was Labov's, in every respect, impressive PhD thesis on the social stratification of English in New York City from 1966, which became the paradigm for a whole new enterprise, variational linguistics. Here we get the new operationalization of old concepts such as style, i.e. as determined by the linguistic and extra-linguistic situational context, and a whole new set of household words like the observer's paradox. The paradox that we're interested mostly in how people speak when we're not there to observe them, and we can only document their linguistic behavior if we are there to observe and record them. The study, which despite its volume is a consistent pleasure to read and study in depth, has been so influential that 40 years later, Lebas was able to reprint it with a number of extremely valuable additions to document what had happened in the wake of it. And what happened, we can see now, was primarily that linguists got a choice. From now on, they were able to choose between a generative paradigm based on the idea of creating models of the individual speaker's knowledge of his language, that is, his or her knowledge of his or her own language, on the one hand, and the observation of how people actually use their linguistic resources, how they evaluate the variation present inside the speech community, and how variation leads to change inside speech communities bound together by linguistic values on the other. A number of people chose to follow the call of William Lebas, and soon a whole new wave of social linguistics took off, never to lose its impetus to this day. I need only mention the 2 volumes on social linguistic patterns and language in the inner city, the Old and the New Testament, for those of us who studied it, the very influential Philadelphia study, and lately the majestic 3-volume work on the principles of linguistic change. Consciously modeling the work on a book by Hermann Paul, which at the end of the 19th century summed up the wisdom of the neo-grammarians, his great and recognized forerunners, Lebas, in his 3 books, sums up the results of the study of variation since the beginnings for the conceptualization of language change. From now on, this will be the natural starting point for any discussion of language change. Recently, Lebas, who is already an editor, co-editor of the journal Language Variation and Change, has started a new one, co-editing with Dennis Preston, the brand new Journal of Linguistic Geography. Firmly placed in the epicenter of this tempestuous development, William Lebas has consistently taught generations of linguists from his chair in linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania. So much so that all of us, whether we belong to the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd generation, the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd wave of social linguistics, we're all Bill Lebas pupils. Lebas has himself consistently denied that social linguistics is a sub-branch of linguistics. It is linguistics, fair and square, as an empirical science. And Lebas is a fantastic field worker, the best teacher I've ever had in how to do linguistics, and he has contributed to the solution of almost all of those problems that he and his teacher Uriel Weinreich, seconded by Marvin Herzog, identified in their trailblazing paper from 1969 on the empirical basis of linguistics. This paper is visionary and exemplary in the best sense of this word. It has guided our efforts ever since. Linguistics has been opened up once again towards the scrutiny of sociological, historical, and anthropological perspectives in language, and once more, the goal is to understand the enigma that is ours, the human language, in an integration of all these perspectives with the most detailed analysis of the linguistic elements themselves and their life and communities as used by the members of the community for all the various purposes we have when we speak. Linguistics as an enterprise is a central discipline of the humanities. And yet, sociolinguists use statistical methods like the sociologists. We carry out field work like the anthropologists. We produce models of language production and perception that have to square with facts from neurology, neuroanatomy, and psychology. Humanities are not alone in the world, but an integrated part of the scientific endeavor to find fallible generalizations and at least temporary truths. The Nobel Prize may be reserved for the sciences, but inside the humanities, we too have our counterparts to Nobel laureates, and tonight we're going to listen to one of them. Before I conclude this introduction, there's one characteristic I'd like to single out as essential in a sketch of what kind of researcher we are dealing with here. This is a uniquely generous and social scientist who believes in open access to all that has been written and said by himself, if not by others. If you haven't done so already, please visit his homepage and you will find enough materials there to last for a lifetime. It is therefore quite in his spirit that the Royal Danish Academy of Sciences and Letters will make this lecture available on the net after tonight. In this, as in all other respects I can think of, he stands for me as the ideal of a researcher within humanities, a person who has served as a paragon for some of us for more than 50 years now. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Professor William Labov.
Well, thank you very much, Franz and Dr. Hastrup. I'm getting ready for this lecture on the human side of linguistic variation. Has given me the opportunity to reflect on how the research I've done over the past decades has always been an interplay between technical analysis and human understanding. Much of the work on linguistic change and variation has advanced, as Franz noted, with the help of programs for quantitative analysis. It's told us a great deal about the people whose speech we recorded. Now, to bring out the human significance of these findings, I'm going to introduce you to 6 people I've met in the course of this work, getting you to know them in their own words, and then trying to sum up what I've learned from them. They're great speakers of the English language, gifted with an uncommon eloquence, people larger than life. And I think you'll remember them as vividly as anything I have to say about them. So in locating these people, I'll ask you to follow my own trajectory through life and the route by which I met them. The approach that I'm taking is not unrelated to my upbringing and the people I knew early in life. I was born in a small town in the state of New Jersey. My high school years were spent in Fort Lee, a town with a high proportion of working-class German and Italian Americans, just across the Hudson River from New York City. They were the people I knew best, some the closest of friends, others in frequent conflict. But when we met in later years, we always recognized a common ground. I left that community behind when I attended Harvard College from 1944 to 1948. My degree was in English and philosophy, but I studied enough chemistry to serve me well when I began work in the laboratory of a family business. For the next 11 years, as Franz Gregersen noted, I formulated printing inks and silkscreen inks in intimate association with the men of the factory. In 1961, I returned to academic life and took up the study of linguistics at Columbia University in New York City, under Uriel Weinreich. This was an attractive field of intense debate on the structure of language and the history of constant change. However, I discovered that most of the activity was remote from the procedures that I was used to. Most of the linguists I met were gathering data by introspection, asking themselves, can I say this? Can I say that? It occurred to me that I might start a new way of doing linguistics by building the study of language on what people actually said in everyday life. So in this enterprise, I found my years as an industrial chemist weren't wasted. I drew from them 3 assets. One was a firm conviction that the real world would prove you right or wrong when the products of your work were put to the test. Perhaps, as in case of paints and inks, by harsh weather or high-speed printing presses or whatever it might be. Second was that this result depended on a certain precision of method. You would never know if you were right or wrong unless you had carefully entered in your notebook each step you'd taken. The third asset was a lasting acquaintance with working-class styles of speech, ways of arguing, joking, telling stories, and passing the time during the noon-hour break. These were the elements that I put to work in a field that came to be called social linguistics, or more recently, the study of linguistic change and variation. My first chance to test this approach was on a visit to a friend on the island of Martha's Vineyard, where I noticed a particular way of speaking that had not been reported before. People saying, right about now, instead of right about now. It was particularly interesting because the Linguistic Atlas of New England, a generation before, had reported that vineyarders were saying out, not out. And this sound change was actually reversing the direction of history. I began to trace this sound change by recording people all over the island. The first interviews I did reflected the traditional methods of dialect geography, full of questions about New England regional words and expressions. One of the first people I met and talked to was Donald Poole, an 8th-generation descendant of Yankee whalers and fishermen. He was one of the key figures in the little fishing town of Menemsha. I was told, up there in the corner, the long-term summer people counted themselves as having arrived if Donald Poole said hello to them on the dock. And Donald Poole was a great speaker. You couldn't talk to him for 5 minutes without being drawn into the major issues of living and earning a living. As I listened to him, I became more and more immersed in what he was saying as well as how he was saying it. You can hear him yourself. The tape recorder was not the best. You'll have to bear with the background noise, mostly from spring peepers, the little frogs, that were very loud at that time of the year.
You see, you people who come down here in Martha's Vineyard don't understand the background of the old families on the island. Strictly maritime background and tradition. Our interests run that way, our thoughts still run that way. I'm speaking now of the descendants of the old families. And what we're interested in, the rest of America, this part over here across the water that belongs to you and we don't have anything to do with, has forgotten all about the maritime tradition and the fact that if it hadn't been for the interest that the early settlers in this country took in the ocean, it was this whalemen, this fishermen, and this seamen and merchant sailors, this country couldn't have existed. The Plymouth colony would have been a failure.
So it became clear that Poole was a prime exponent of Weber's Protestant ethic, with a strong emphasis on the importance of work as a calling. So I asked him, what reason do people have to work harder than they have to earn a living? And this is what he said.
What reason do people have to work harder than they have to earn a living? I can answer that for you, because I've already worked it up for myself, and I can perform with you many minutes. The satisfaction of feeling that you have accomplished something over and above the bare necessities of life. You take a pride in doing the best that you can according to your ability. I don't have to go fishing. I can quit right now and be comfortable. But just as long as I draw the breath of life, I'll be down in my boat in the morning at 6 or 6:30 and 1 pound somewhere doing all that I can, as best as I can, to the best of my ability and knowledge. Because I take a pride in doing that. Something I know and I feel that I'm doing something important. And I'm happier doing that than I would be sitting around the beach. A man with no will and conscience can't sit still. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it did. The particular sound change I was focusing on is exemplified in Donald Poole's I take a pride in doing that. That is, pride in place of pride. We refer to it as centralization because at the beginning of the diphthong, the tongue moves closer to the center of the mouth. To track this variation across many social dimensions, I created a 4-point scale of centralization, which, as I would produce it, from 0, right, to right, to right, to right, or now, no, no, and no. Using both acoustic and auditory measurement, I was able to establish a mean centralization value of the vowels of I and ow for each individual. The progress of the sound change on the island seemed variable in the extreme, correlated not only with age, but also with gender, occupation, neighborhood, and ethnicity. So my interviewing methods had accordingly shifted to a broader range of social issues. In my interviews with fishermen, farmers, local businessmen, Yankees, gayhead Indians, and Portuguese, I found a connection between the sound change and the major concerns that troubled people in everyday life. I found the local people were under great pressure from the wealthy summer people from the mainland, who were buying up as much of the shoreline property as they could. Some younger people left the island to earn a living on the mainland, but others stayed and resisted this outside pressure. Centralization was strongest among them. Donald Poole was archetypical for his generation. And by the way, you can see Donald Poole. He walks across the screen in the first shots of Jaws, which was filmed on Martha's Vineyard. Now his son, Everett Poole, was even more so. He had returned from college to set up a business selling fish on the Menemsha docks, and his centralization values were the most extreme. Where his father said, "I take a pride in doing that," his son said, "He tried and tried until he was tired out entirely." Reviewing the interviews as a whole, some expressed positive orientation towards remaining on and working on the island, others were neutral, and a small number were negative, indicating a strong motivation to leave the island. The clearest correlation found between centralization and social factors is shown on this slide, which associates centralization with orientation towards the island. 40 people with positive orientation had values of 62 and 63. 19 with a neutral position had values of 32 and 42, and 6 who were negative towards the island had centralization values of only 9 and 8. So these centralization figures emerged as a symbol of social identity, driven by an unconscious mechanism of incrementation as the struggle to maintain local rights and privileges intensifies across generations. The finding has been generally accepted, frequently cited, and taken as paradigmatic for the social motivation of sound change. Studies of many other small communities under outside pressure have found a similar resurgence of linguistic markers of social identity. It's been pointed out to me that the island of Bonum here in Denmark probably follows the same pattern. One found that the phenomenon was no longer present of the two linguists who revisited Martha's Vineyard. The other found that it was, and it continued vigorously for some time, but showed signs of recession among the youngest speakers. Now, the Martha's Vineyard study was my master's essay. My dissertation, as Franz Gregersen pointed out, was an attack on a larger problem, the widespread variability in the speech of New York City, which had frequently been described as chaotic and unpredictable. The problem of method became central here. New Yorkers were extremely self-conscious and negative in regard to their local dialect. When any attention was paid to language, they tended to correct their pronunciation in an irregular fashion towards a form of speech as different from New York as possible. I had to overcome this tendency if I wanted to record the vernacular, which was my target. That is the first learned form of language that's used with friends and family when no outside observer was present. For that reason, my interview developed techniques for eliciting narratives of personal experience, where speakers were so deep in their involvement in what was being said, they paid little attention to how it was said. I used this instrument in a survey of the Lower East Side of New York City, building on a random sample constructed for a social science project on delinquency and opportunity by Cloward and Olin. On the summer of 1963, I called on the brownstone house of Jacob Schissel, 63 years old, who had recently retired from the Post Service. At one point in the interview, I asked Schissel if he'd ever been in a situation where he thought he was going to be killed. He said, "Yes, my brother put a knife in my head." I said, "What happened?" And this is what he said.
A few days after my father had died, and we were sitting shivering. The reason the fight started, he saw a rat out in the yard. This was out in Coney Island, and he started talking about it. My mother had just sat down to have a cup of coffee, and I told him to cut it out. Of course, kids, you don't have to listen to me. That's when I grabbed him by the arm and twisted it up behind him. When I let go of his arm, there was a knife on the table. He just picked it up and he let me have it. And I started bleeding like a pig. And I asked him if he knew, run to the doctor. And the doctor just says, "It's about this much more." He said, "You'd have been dead."
You heard his wife in the background. She had never heard this story before. I've been living with this narrative for 45 years. Whether I tell it or I play the tape, it has an extraordinary force that commands the attention of an audience, large or small, creating the total silence that we just witnessed. I'm trying to understand how this and other narratives told in our interviews can transfer the experience of the speaker to the listener in such a compelling way. I've been drawn into the study of narrative itself, and I have a book called The Language of Life and Death, in which Jacob Schissel's story appears. There are cultural details specific to the Jewish community, the family sitting Shiva, that is 7 days for the dead, and the preference for silence, but the issues of life and death and how we deal with them are universal. So in 1967, I wrote a paper with Joshua Waletsky on narrative analysis. It provided a structural framework that is today widely used in the field of narrative studies. It's actually cited in more than half of the papers published in the journal Narrative Inquiry. Several of my later papers on narrative wrestle with the central question of this and many other narratives: what brings about the sudden escalation of violence when words give way to action and aggression? I pursue that in The Language of Life and Death. But what are the linguistic implications of Jacob Schissel's interview? You may have noted as a speaker of the New York City vernacular, he used the traditional R-less pronunciation. He started to talk about it, not,
He started talking about it.
And
that's when I grabbed him by the arm and twisted it up behind him. When I let go of his arm.
So you hear the R-less pronunciation of all these words. So this shows the frequency, the percent of consonantal R used by Jacob Schisel in 5 styles in the course of the interview: casual speech, as in his narratives; careful speech; reading style; word lists; and minimal pairs. With increasing focus on R as style becomes more careful. So this is what we heard in the section. Then, when he was reading more carefully, he pronounced talk, dog, thought, 44, and then in minimal pairs, guard versus God, doc versus dark, pronouncing the R. As an older traditional user of the New York City pattern, Schissel's use of consonantal R was close to 0 until we reached word lists, where he pronounced R 30% of the time. Minimal pairs 75% of the time. In itself, this tells us nothing more than that Jacob Schisel thought he should pronounce R as a consonant. But when we superimpose this pattern on the Lower East Side as a whole, we see that it's part of the system that unites the city as a whole. We see the social differentiation of the use of consonantal R as characteristic of the community as a whole. The higher the social class, the more R. At the same time, New Yorkers agree, all of them, in their evaluation of R. All social class groups increase consonantal R with increasing attention paid to speech, middle class, upper working class, lower working class. The display of independent effects of style and social class changed the view of this urban speech community from chaotic unpredictability to what Weinreich called orderly heterogeneity. And that's the central concept of social linguistics today. We see in the constant slope of style shifting a community united by consensus, yet in each context differentiated by social class. Similar patterns have been found in many, many other cities and many other languages. The study of such social linguistic variables has since yielded rich information on how sharply stratified a community is, the degree of social mobility, and how linguistic change moves through the system. Now, the random survey of the Lower East Side included a good percentage of African Americans. Through a number of incidental and accidental observations, I became convinced that the techniques for approaching the vernacular of white speakers didn't work well for African Americans. The speech I was recording from them reflected more their accommodation to me than the speech patterns they used when they were talking to each other. At the same time, I became aware that a study of the African American vernacular might be useful in attacking one of the major problems of our society: the minority gap in academic achievement. I obtained funds from the Office of Education to approach the problem in a systematic way. We set up a team project in South Harlem of African-American field workers and linguists. We rented a clubhouse on 112th Street, and there interviewed members of all the named groups of African-American youth in a 4-block area. The pre-adolescent Thunderbirds and Aces, the adolescent Jets and Cobras, the young adult Oscar Brothers. In many interviews at the clubhouse and group sessions in the basement of Columbia University building, we came close to solving the observer's paradox. That is, to observe how people behave when they're not being observed. Again, citing Franz Gregerson introduced us to that. One of the core members of the Jets was Larry Hawthorne. He was then 16 years old, one of the 6 best fighters of the group, a gifted storyteller and a speaker of uncommon eloquence. I would like to play an excerpt from an interview conducted by our best field worker, KC, who appeared to the Jets as an older version of themselves. The initials KC referred to his boxing name, Kid Chocolate. Many of the youth had become involved in this Nation of Islam, and Casey was engaging Larry in a Socratic dialogue on matters of belief.
What happens to you after you die? Yeah, I know. After they put you in the ground, your body turns into bones and shit. Your spirit, as soon as you die, your spirit leaves.
I'm gonna.
What you think?
Okay.
You know, like some people say, if you're good and shit, your spirit going to heaven. You're good. If you're bad, your spirit going to hell. But bullshit, your spirit going to hell anyway, good or bad. You know? Why? Why? I'll tell you why. Because you see, doesn't nobody really know that it's a God, you know? Because I mean, I have seen black gods, pink gods, white gods, all color gods. And don't nobody know it's really a God. And when they be saying if you're good, you're going to heaven, that's bullshit. Because you ain't going to no heaven. Because it ain't no heaven for you to go to.
If there's no heaven, how could there be hell?
I mean, yeah. Well, let me tell you, it ain't no hell because this is hell right here, you know? Yeah, this is hell right here.
I couldn't help noting here, this interview I used as a basis for my paper called The Logic of Non-Standard English, and Larry's use of the rules of logic were the central theme. But it's interesting that we compare this to Faustus and Marlowe. Where are your damned, says Faustus. Mephistopheles in hell. And Faustus says, how comes it then that thou art out of hell? And Mephistopheles says, why, this is hell, nor am I out of it. So the social situation of black youth in Harlem is reflected in Larry's
But you don't
television.
really know if it's a God or not. Nobody really knows that. Nobody.
That's true. But just saying that the distance happened. What color is it? White or black?
He'll be white, man. Why? I tell you why. Because the average whitey out here got everything, you dig? And a nigga ain't got shit, you know? You understand? So for that to happen, you know it ain't no black guard that's doing that bullshit.
Yeah, I gotta go for that, bro.
Hey, that's square business, man.
So this paper in which I quoted this was response to the common view of educational psychologists that African American youth have no true language of their own. What they speak is a series of emotional cries, giant words with no logical structure. And they must learn to speak standard English before they can learn anything else. The article has been reprinted hundreds of times, more than anything else I've written, and the quotation from Larry has been cited many more times than that. The argument that I put forward that African American vernacular English is a well-formed dialect with all the structure necessary for logical thought was obvious to linguists, but not to teachers or educators. The view that it argued against, that this form of speech is nothing but a collection of bad words and mistakes, and that poor black children are mentally handicapped by it, is not dead. Indeed, a rather proper English educator, John Honey, based a whole book on the theme that Larry wasn't logical after all. Now, our studies of Larry's dialect had a considerable effect on the field of linguistics. For the first time, we studied the internal linguistic factors that control variation, that is, the phonological and grammatical environment. I can best illustrate this by referring to the one variable that took the most attention, the variation in the realization of the verb in auxiliary is. So every speaker of the dialect uses three different forms. The full form is, the contracted form, as it ain't no black god that's doing that bullshit, and the zero form, if you be bad, your spirit going to hell. Other dialects showed only two, the full and contracted form, but not zero. Some early observers of this dialect, familiar with Caribbean Creole languages, argued that the zero form was the true dialect, and the others were importations from Standard English. But we concluded, from the systematic way in which the forms of is varied, according to the preceding and following elements, that the copula had a firm foundation as the full form in the underlying grammar. The contraction removed the vowel if it was unstressed, and the zero form was a further extension of contraction. These patterns were replicated in many other studies, showing something more astonishing, that African American vernacular English had the same uniform grammar across the entire United States. And this slide from an article by John Rickford superimposes the results of 8 studies of the effect of the following grammatical element on the deletion. The vertical axis is the percent of the zero form of is. The horizontal axis shows the following grammatical form. A noun phrase, as in he my brother, with the lowest percentage, then adjectives, as in he crazy, and locatives, as in he outside, and he talking a lot, in the verb, or he gonna do it, with a steadily increasing percentage of the zero form. Now the red and orange lines show our Harlem studies, the Thunderbirds, the Jets, and the Cobras. The green line is Walt Wolfram's 1967 study of adolescent speakers in Detroit. The purple line is a speaker from the Bay Area. The orange line is from John Ball's research in Pacoima, a black suburb of Los Angeles. And the yellow and brown lines are results from Guy Bailey and Sucro Avala's long-term study of a small town in Texas. The basic pattern is replicated throughout the United States, along with all other grammatical features of this dialect. An explanation of the pattern you see here and the national uniformity is still high on the agenda for the many students of change and variation who are concerned with the speech of African Americans. My major interest in the study of language has always been on the causes of linguistic change, and particularly change from within the system, not borrowed from some outside center of prestige. In New York City, a third of the vowels were engaged in such internal change. In 1970, I moved to the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where 2/3 of the vowels were changing. While the causes of such instability remain mysterious, we made some progress by changing the question from why does language change to who is changing the language. An hypothesis emerged from the New York City study and 2 others that followed the same results. Peter Trudgill's work in Norwich and Henrietta Cedergren's study of Panama City. The curvilinear hypothesis argued that internal linguistic change was not initiated in the highest or the lowest social classes, as had previously been thought, but began in the centrally located upper working and lower middle classes. So I engaged in a search for the leaders of linguistic change in Philadelphia throughout the 1970s, with long-term studies of 10 neighborhoods shown here. One of the upper working class neighborhoods was in South Philadelphia. Here's a view of our fair city, and that's the region of South Philadelphia we're talking about. In one South Philadelphia neighborhood, we met Celeste Sullivan. She was a central figure on her block and introduced us to many other people. As you'll hear, she was a strong exponent of Philadelphia vowel shifts. But the effect of this strong local accent will be submerged in the impression of a powerful personality, an arranger and controller of the world of social relations. I'll introduce her to you by playing one of 6 narratives from chapter 12 of my second volume on Principles of Linguistic Change, a chapter devoted to the description of the leaders of linguistic change in Philadelphia. Here she's being interviewed by our gifted field worker, Ann Bauer. The story involves USO canteens for servicemen set up during World War II.
One of mother used to send, I used to go to the movies and she used to send a couple of boys up the street to watch who I used to be in the movies with. Oh yeah. But we were in cahoots, the boys and I. Yeah. That's the only way you could get out of it. Or like we date, I would date. And like my father would say, where are you going? Well, Daddy, now look, Georgie's going to take me, Georgie, down the street. See, and Daddy thought, oh boy, she's safe with Georgie. So Georgie would go his way, and I would go my way. And then we would meet. See, at a certain time, I said, Georgie, please, Georgie, don't do that to me. You better be there. He'd say, don't worry, because his father was just as bad as my father. We would meet, and we'd come home like two nice little kids. But I used to go dance at the canteen. Yeah, they had a canteen that was all servicemen. And you couldn't get in if you didn't have a date. And you'd have to be a serviceman to take you in. But once you got in, you could leave this guy, you know, and dance with everybody else. And that's what we used to do, stand in the corner and wait for the fellas, and I'd say to one that's yours, are you going in there? And they'd say, yeah, would you take me in? Sure. And they would take it, and nothing bad would happen. And then the Salvation Army ran a beautiful thing. And it was only coffee and donuts, there was no drinking and soda and music. All night you dance, dance, dance.
So you heard the extreme raising of short A, where bad is pronounced beard. Dance as dance, 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 with a high vowel. The curvilinear pattern confirming our hypothesis emerged. As shown in this figure 5, the vertical axis is a measure of the fronting of ow in south and down. The horizontal axis shows 6 social groups. You can see the most extreme forms are in the middle and upper working class. Here is Celeste. These show the regression lines for the various social classes, and Celeste's social class is the purple line, the upper working class rising up, and this shows you how far above she is of her own group. She's a leader of the leading social class. So people at the bottom of the scale say down. People at the top of the scale say down, with an initial vowel of A. So the circle shows Celeste at 47 years of age, and her scale number is 2463 on the owl index. There's much more to the story of Celeste. This is a sociometric diagram showing that for this block network, the people who were named as friends in the interviews. Celeste is a sociometric star at the center of the network, with symmetrical arrows showing who she named and who named her. The number above her name is the ow index, which, as you'll see, she's the highest. The number below her name is a communication index. She's also the highest. The index combines the density of contacts within the neighborhood with the proportion of contacts outside the neighborhood. Thus, Celeste fits into the model of the two-step flow of influence that was developed by Katz and Lazarsfeld in their studies of the diffusion of innovation in Decatur, Illinois, and elsewhere. In the model, information and influence do not flow evenly from the larger society to all members of the group. Rather, they are a small number of individuals, variously called influentials or opinion leaders, who receive and transmit the latest forms, fashions, ideas, and information to those in the network around them. So Celeste was not simply a conduit of information and fashion. She was a powerful force for altering the social world around her. In the narrative you heard, she dealt with heavily controlling influence of the patriarchal Italian family. She deals with her father through George, and she controls George as well. You better be there. She manipulates the rules of the canteen by negotiating with the sailors who take her in. And once inside, she organizes things as well. She told another story of how she said to a friend in the canteen, "You see that guy in the corner? I'm going to marry him." "Oh, you're crazy. You don't even know who he is." But she did. She did marry him. That was Jim Sullivan, the draftsman whose Irish name she bears. Through the study of Celeste's career and a half a dozen others, we began to define more closely these leaders of linguistic change. They're young women from the second or third generation of newly arriving ethnic groups, upwardly mobile, defiant of social norms that they consider unwarranted and unjust, and quick to intervene when they judge things to be going wrong. Essentially, they're nonconformists. Nonconformity seems to be intimately associated with the incrementation of linguistic change. As I noted before, the archetypical exponents of linguistic change in progress are marked by that characteristic feature of mainstream America, upward social mobility. Not only do they have better jobs than their parents, but until recently they could expect their children to have better lives than their own. In my study of the Lower East Side of New York City, this was true of all groups except African Americans, who generally showed downward social mobility. And nothing that I had done arrested that tendency. Though I learned a great deal from Larry Hawthorne, he did not learn much from me. And as the years went by, the rates of violent death, incarceration, and poverty increased for African American residents of the city centers. As a member of the National Academy of Sciences, I was appointed to a committee on preventing reading difficulties among young children, where I learned a fair amount about reading research, but found that none of the current methods were effective in closing the minority gap in reading achievement, which you see here. Starting with the period of Larry Hawthorne to 2004, one question that was ever present in my mind was whether linguistic research could be useful where other methods had failed. So in 1997, with the initial help of funding legislated by Senator Specter, I began research within the schools on ways to use our knowledge of African American youth to raise reading levels in low-income elementary schools. Some of that information had to do with dialect differences and how they affected reading. More important is what I learned from Larry Hawthorne, the Jets, and the Cobras on their experience, attitudes, and ways of thinking, in particular their deep distrust of the school as an institution, and the resentment of the unfairness of the everyday practices of a racist society. Over a period of 10 years, I developed a tutorial program for training undergraduate tutors in local schools, which was tested on a national scale for struggling readers who were white, African American, and Latino. This Reading Road program puts to work our knowledge of the alphabet, our knowledge of children's language, and our knowledge of children's interests, concerns, and problems. To learn more about the language and experience of the children involved, over 500 were interviewed and recorded in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grades. We used what we had learned about how to get people to talk freely about things that really mattered to them with such questions as, did you ever get blamed for something you didn't do? Did you ever have a dream that really scared you? Now, the 5th speaker I'd like to present to you, someone from whom I learned a great deal about language and about life, is Latasha, an African-American girl in a West Philadelphia school.
Well, I used to be bad. I used to be bad in 1st grade and kindergarten. And then when they come to 2nd grade and stuff, they always blame me stuff because they know I always do that. But I always be good in 2nd grade. But I used to be bad in 1st and kindergarten because it wasn't really nothing to do. So I just be bad. And when they come to 2nd grade, they always blame stuff on me. Like yesterday, I got blamed because some girl hit somebody and they were jumping and they thought it was me and my friends. Me and my cousin and my friend, they always blame stuff on us, and that's not right. And I told my mom, and my mom don't do nothing. She just said, be good.
Latasha is archetypical of a young, intelligent student who's getting deeper and deeper into trouble with the school system. In the 2nd grade, she's due to get an F in behavior. She's not alone. A sizable number of the children we tutor are suspended and expelled for fighting. Over the years, I've done my best to address this problem in the stories and graphic novels that are at the heart of our instructional method. I'd like to illustrate our approach to the problem by a few pages from several different stories that deal with conflict resolution. Each of these stories is also written to focus on a particular problem in phoneme-graphic relations. For example, this story, Dealing with Zeke, is about a young man who promised his mother to stay out of trouble, but runs into a rough case in school. The colored features, letters, highlight words that follow the silent E rule, the focus of the story. First, we have the mother who warns, my mom used to say, boy, don't play the fool. You know I work all day, so you need to be in school. I went to school to have a good week. It would have been fine if not for that Zeke. So on the next page, Jamal encounters Zeke. As I walked across the street, there was Zeke standing in the schoolyard, acting all hard. I tried to walk by, but Zeke was an ace at bumping into kids, and then he'd make a mean face. So the colored letters highlight the words that follow the silent E rule, the focus of the story. Here is another story which actually is based upon Larry Hawthorne, the black adolescent of the 1970s, who told me that a story about this, take off your coat. It's an example from our commercial version of Portals, published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. It's actually drawn from Larry's experience. As I said, his disciplinary record in high school recorded his refusal to take off his coat in class. So when asked about it, Larry said he had a hole in his pants, but he wasn't going to take off his coat or explain it to his teacher. So my version, the hero Chad, has also promised his mother to stay out of trouble, but when he helps a little girl to get her cat out of a bush, he rips a big hole in his pants. He heads to school hoping his coat will cover it. But the teacher decides to make an issue of it. Why is your coat still on? And he says, it's cold in here. I need to keep my coat on. It's not cold, she says. Look at the temperature. Would you mind taking your coat off? This is what he winds up with in detention hall. And a friend says to him, why not tell him about it? And Chad says, how? A lot of the stories that we write are more upbeat than this one and find a solution to the problem in one way or another. The issues are open to debate and discussion and comprehension questions that are posed by the program. Now, they engage the interest of the struggling readers, and one can expect pretty good results. Now, this is a record of the improvement in reading skills for Latasha's cadre of African American children in Philadelphia, the same year that she was tutored. The blue line is the rate of errors in the pretest for the whole range of phonic structures that have to be decoded, and they're shown across the bottom. So we have typical words like in the coda, cat, pass, past, belt, next, right, with 3 filing consonants, and the rate of errors, as you see, rises, but the improvement is marked. The magenta line shows the reduction in the error rate after 24 hours of tutoring. I hope that our efforts to promote conflict resolution will have the same good success as our efforts to advance decoding skills. But we lost Latasha. Her F in behavior got her expelled. And listening more carefully to Latasha tells us something about the deeper reasons. In answer to the question, did you ever get into a fight with a kid bigger than you? Latasha gave an answer which reflected the fact that she was wearing a necklace with pictures of 2 little kids. One was her brother and one was her cousin who had been shot dead the year before. So she says,
well, my brother did, right? And my brother used to smoke cigarettes. And it was some little girl, she a fake Muslim. Because he said, that's why your brother did, because he was smoking cigarettes on the corner and stuff, having guns and stuff. And my brother do not have guns. All the people, they say my brother was a peacemaker. They kept on talking about my brother, and I just got to fight with him.
A little later on, Latasha gives us a further reflection on how she viewed the world around her.
That's why I want to be in some other, not other world, but I want to be in some other country, because around my way, it's drama around my way. I'm not just scared of him, but I just want to live. Like my brother and my cousin did, and they kept on talking about them, so I got to fight with them.
Latasha was 7 years old. Now, the graphic novels that I've written are intended to make contact with the problems of her everyday life, but they don't extend to the full measure of grim reality. You've heard one answer to the question, why do these little girls behave so badly? Latasha obeys a deep human imperative to keep faith with the dead. And I would ask, who are we to put a higher value on the school's peculiar rule, report every problem to the teacher and never raise a hand in anger? I do not have an answer to this question, but it's omnipresent in our efforts to recreate children's confidence in an educational system that has abandoned them in isolation and despair. This work is part of a program strongly rooted at the University of Pennsylvania to apply academic research to the solution of community problems. It reflects the philosophy that the state of our knowledge is most clearly defined by our success or failure in attempting to change the world around us. This view came with me from my early experience in the industrial world, but it's also reinforced by my participation in the Netter Center for Community Partnership at Penn. That's not to say that all academic pursuit should be driven by application. Certainly, there are many fields of study that are motivated simply by our desire to know, not only in cosmology and mathematics, but in my own field to discover the mysterious forces that are responsible for the continued renewal of linguistic change. Nevertheless, I return to the theme that any success we have in applied to the social problems of our society gives us greater confidence in whether we are on the right track. So far, I've been dealing with what I've learned from working class and lower class speakers. Now we'll return to the view of the speech community as a whole and the growing role of the middle class. The description of Philadelphia English, exemplified by the archetypical speaker Celeste Sullivan, was based on a study of 10 neighborhoods done in the 1970s. We continued to study Philadelphia neighborhoods year by year, and 3 years ago we assembled the Philadelphia Neighborhood Corpus using new computational methods for the automatic alignment and measurement of vowel systems that greatly increased the accuracy and volume of measurement, yielding 5,000 to 10,000 measurements instead of 200 to 300. Some 380 speakers have been measured after being transcribed. This allowed us to trace the paths of sound change for over a period of 100 years by the date of birth of the speaker. So we found two distinct patterns. One was a continuous incrementation from 1888 to 1991, shared by all members of the community. Typical of these was the very same variable that I had traced in Martha's Vineyard, the centralization of I before voiceless consonants, in life, like, right, as opposed to side and wide and by. Now here we see locally weighted regression analyses that trace the steady increase from I to I across this period. The vertical axis is the acoustically defined first formant, a measure of vowel height that ranges from A at the bottom to E at the top. The horizontal axis shows date of birth from 1888 on the left to 1992 on the right. The gray areas show 95% confidence intervals for the correctness of the central tendencies, shown by the dark lines. The left-hand diagram differentiates men, who are solid lines, from women, open symbols and dashed lines. They're essentially the same. The right-hand diagram differentiates speakers with high school education, or less, that's the dashed line, from those with higher education, the solid line and dark symbols. Again, no difference appears until the latest period, where those with higher education are actually leading. This dramatic view of change in progress carries us from the beginning of the 20th century, when there was no difference between right and ride, to the beginning of the 21st, where right has a central nucleus, fully distinct from ride with a low nucleus. This sound change, like all changes in their early stages, is well below the level of social consciousness. The entire community moves together without anyone being aware of it. But more salient features of the dialect in their later stages show sharp social stratification. And beginning in the middle of the 20th century, they began to retreat. Most extreme in this respect is the class of tensed and raised short A vowel words, defined by a complex set of phonetic, lexical, and grammatical conditions. So, for example, 3 words before D are tense: mad, bad, glad. But all others are lax: sad, dad, ad, and so on. Vowels before F, th, and S are tense: half, bath, last. Short A before nasals is tense, unless a vowel follows, so tense ham, but lacks hammer. We heard the extreme forms of this vowel class from Celeste Sullivan when she said, nothing bad would happen, and dance, dance, dance. Here we see the locally weighted regression diagram showing on the left that women lead in this retreat. On the right, we see from the outset those with higher education. The dark lines are behind and fall further below in recent years. So this is equivalent to the correction from bad to bad. So what's the social meaning of this retreat? Local dialects can be associated with lack of education and knowledge of the broader world, with laziness and limitation. But in the United States, it's also possible for them to be associated with negative attitudes towards race, particularly African Americans. I'm not yet sure to what extent this is true for the Philadelphia dialect, but I will put forward as my last prototypical speaker an exemplar from the middle class who correlates a rejection of the salient features of the local dialect with a fierce opposition to racism. So in 2010, members of my class on the study of the speech community interviewed a 30-year-old woman who had just been hired to direct study abroad programs for a local university. She had been in East Asian studies and had studied abroad in France and Korea, and she decided to devote herself to helping other students have that experience. In talking about her experience in France, this is what she said.
I remember feeling very uncomfortable living with my French host family because their views of religion and race were very different than my own views. I don't think it was like a French thing, but their culture very much conflicted with what I felt. Like my French mother was sort of very dismissive of Arabs in France, and her views of immigration were, I mean, to me, incredibly racist. But I sort of felt as though, you know, it's not my place to voice my opinions about this, and, you know, am I really gonna have a conversation with this woman? So she would say things like, go get some bread from the Arab down the street. And I would say, oh, you mean, you know, and I would say the name of the store, and she'd be like, oh yeah.
Now, Nicole's opposition to racist language was further exemplified in this account of her interaction with her boyfriend's family.
My boyfriend's uncle is very, like, old school. Like, grew up in South Philadelphia, was a jeweler, like, very entrenched in this idea of, like, Italian-American, South Philadelphia views. And part of what I think to be part of this identity is kind of being a racist. Like, we'll go there for dinner on Sundays, and when we first started dating, maybe the first year or two, he would just say, like, the N-word. You know, I was still kind of new to the family. I didn't want to cause any conflict, but, like, I cringed. I'm like, are you really you're gonna say this? I can't believe this. So to hear his uncle talk like that or say really demeaning things about African Americans really made me mad. So probably like 3-4 years into the relationship, I would start saying things because I felt, all right, we've passed the line of like, oh, I'm the new girlfriend, you know, and like they knew what I did for a job and that I was not okay using those words or even hearing them. And now I'm like 8 years into a relationship, I'll call him out and be like, or he'll apologize to me sometimes, and he's gotten so much better not using that language. And but no one had ever challenged him. Like, if I'm there, I don't care, whatever. You can say whatever you want, alone. But if I'm at that dinner table, I don't want to hear it. And it's worked. So if I choose one person, it's that.
So we can examine Nicole's, by the way, the N-word she's talking about. I would not be able to pronounce if this were a podium in the United States, because nigger has become such an obscene and word cannot be used in public. So let's examine her position in regard to that variable that I found had changed over 100 years. What is she doing? And this is her pronunciation. Lake. And you see there she's located right in the upper edge of this distribution. Here is the older speakers saying like, here's like, here's like, and here's her lake right here, indicating that she is indeed well advanced in this compared to 380 speakers in the Philadelphia neighborhood corpus. So we can locate her in those regression diagrams. There she is, close to the top, on the left, showing men and women, and close to the top when we look at education. Nicole is indeed a leader of linguistic change for these new and unsalient members of the system. She's fully participating in the change in progress along with other Philadelphians. Now let's turn to the tense short A vowel, which is shown here with a large distribution of the traditional system way up here. And this is her pronunciation, which you heard.
Really made me mad.
Mad. And here's Nicole down here, leading in the retreat from this traditional pattern. And this final diagram will show how she's located in regard to the community as a whole, leading the retreat on the way to A. Her opposition to racist thinking and racist language is correlated with her development of the Philadelphia vernacular. How deep is the connection between the two remains to be seen. It appears that the greatest change in race relations in the past 2 decades has been the growth of the consensus of social disapproval of the use of racist language in public. Upper middle class, college-educated people like Nicole have been the leaders in this change, as they have in the reversal of the most salient sound changes that mark the local vernacular. And here's a diagram prepared by Joe Frewald of our Philadelphia neighborhood corpus showing the use of terms for African Americans. The orange in the upper left is the earlier use of nigger, which we see is terminated in 1992. No one born after that uses the term at all. The green line shows colored, which is a euphemism for Negro or nigger, used by people who want to be a little more polite, and that has disappeared as completely, and it is replaced entirely by the blue, which represents black, the word black, and the red representing African Americans. So this shows us how effective in changing linguistic practice has been the opinion of middle-class people like Nicole. Her campaign against the one use in South Philadelphia is reflected in this pattern for the community as a whole. So in this presentation of the human side of linguistic variation, I've used the speech of prototypical individuals in combination with the quantitative analysis of the social groups that they speak for. Now, these people are more than objects of inquiry. I'm not playing the part of a doctor introducing you to my patients, or a lawyer introducing you to my clients, nor are these experiments in which I'm introducing you to my subjects. These are people that I've learned from. They're a small sample of many thousands. I've chosen them because each possesses an uncommon eloquence. They're archetypical of the social group they represent, because each in their own way are masters of the English language, to the extent that allows them to share with us their experience in life and their view of the world. Over the years, their words have had a profound effect upon me. I don't know when it happened. I suppose that, like most linguists, I was always in love with language. But somewhere in this business of listening to people, I found that I have fallen in love with humanity. If this talk has succeeded, you will, to some degree, have done so as well. Thank you.
Let me first of all thank you, William Labov, here for a fantastic lecture. I think that this series of lectures here couldn't have started in any better way. And this series of lectures was actually sort of initiated, I guess, half a year ago when the president of Royal Danish Academy, Kirsten Hastrup, and I met. And I guess we more or less at the same time have got the same idea, in the sense that the Royal Danish Academy already have a series of lectures, Nobel laureate lectures, mainly in the area of natural science and social science economics, where we have the Nobel laureates. But given the fact that the Carlsberg Foundation is giving money back to basic science in natural science, humanities, and social science, it was obvious also to have a series of lectures in humanities and social science. And the Carlsberg Foundation was happy to give a sponsorship to the Royal Danish Academy so this could happen here. And I must say, when I'm standing here today, I've listened to this fantastic lecture here, and also seeing so many young people here in the audience here, I'm a very happy man today, because this was exactly what the intention for these lectures were. That was to give a series of lectures by outstanding professors, speakers, who could address not only sort of the established professors at the university, but actually speak to young people like you, students, PhD students, postdocs. I would keep speaking while Eva is running around. And also to the public, because I think it's incredibly important that although we at universities here would like to do outstanding science, publish them in peer-reviewed papers, in monographs and so forth, it's also very important to communicate that science outside our own narrow area of expertise. So, as you can see, I right now have the privilege to be the chairman of the Carlsberg Foundation and also to be the chairman of the board of the Carlsberg Brewery. So I will, in the next few minutes here, spend a little bit of time telling you about the Carlsberg Foundation and also the Carlsberg Brewery. But I would also, again, thank you again, Professor Labov, for this fantastic lecture here. And I think, again, as I've said before, that addressing sort of natural science, humanity, and social science is incredibly important in our society today. I myself is a professor in natural science, and sometimes you hear our dear politicians speak against sort of not spending money on humanities and social science, and I honestly believe it's a very big mistake, because I think we are living in a society today which is very complex, where new is getting normal, and sometimes the new normal is extreme. We are faced with huge challenges in our society today, challenges which cannot be solved by a small group of people. We have to think outside the box and outside the silos. And I think many of the grand challenges today, clean water, clean energy, how we can feed a society which is growing from around 7 billion to around 10 billion people today, can only be addressed by if we are investing in both natural science and social science and humanities. So I really hope that I would have liked to see our dear minister here in the first row today, because I think also this lecture shows in a very elegant way, that was at least one of the messages I took back from me here, was also how Professor Labov have used his initial knowledge in actual chemistry and natural science in total different areas. And as Frans Gregersen said in the beginning, how a person coming from me from the outside suddenly is getting a very, very important person inside here and establishing a whole new way of looking at linguistics. That's what's, to me, very, very pleasing to see. So let's see here, maybe I now can, so what I am doing now, Eva, to move on here, to shift, is that pil? Pil ned? Fine. Okay. So when I say Carlsberg and Tuborg, I'm pretty sure that many of you of the audience know what this is all about. But maybe what many of you do not know is that the history about the Carlsberg and Tuborg is dating back all the way back to 1847. It all started by actually E.C. Jacobsen establishing the Carlsberg Brewery in 1847. He was actually living downtown here in Copenhagen. But he moved out to Valby, a small hill outside Carlsberg, and established the Carlsberg brewing site, named it Carlsberg after his son Karl, and Berg is the German word Bergen for small hill outside Carlsberg. He did so because he have actually went to the professor geology department at Copenhagen University and found out that out there was clean water. And as you know, one of the main ingredients making very good beer is actually having clean water. There's many other ingredients needed, but clean water is just mandatory. He was actually a very, very, I think, interesting person. He was today what you probably call an entrepreneur. He was very bright. He was gifted. He was hardworking. He was dedicated. He had a mission to be one of the leading brewers at his time, not only in Denmark but in Europe, and has succeeded in so. And he earned very many money. He was very rich of his time, but again, sort of quite uniquely, he showed corporate social responsibility because in 1876 he came with a letter to the Royal Danish Academy, basically giving his brewery back to the Royal Danish Academy. And at that time, a foundation was established, the Carlsberg Foundation. He had one son, Karl, was also an eminent brewer. Karl was very much interested in art and sculptures and literature and so forth. And Karl, you know, his private collection is today what we know already today in the Glyptotek. And in 1902, Karl just followed in his footsteps of his father. He also donated his brewery, the new Carlsberg Brewery, to the Carlsberg Foundation. So the Carlsberg Foundation is actually the oldest corporate foundation. The Carlsberg Foundation is still the stock majority owner of the Carlsberg Brewery, and we have many tasks we have to fulfill in the Carlsberg Foundation. One of them is to make success of the Carlsberg Brewery. I'll come back to that in just a second here. The other thing is actually to give money back. Some of the dividend from the stocks we are owning in the Carlsberg Brewery is giving back to basic research within the field of natural science, humanities, and social science. The brewer had a number of core values, and some of them you can read if you go to the Elephant Port here. And again, we're seeing a business era here where we're seeing a lot of greediness in business world, and that is exactly not how Carlsberg should be managed. It should actually be managed in a way we should constantly keep the quality of the beer at the highest level. We should invest in Carlsberg for making a long-term investment in the Carlsberg, and we should not run Carlsberg in trying to optimize the profit on a short term after Q1 and Q2 and Q3. So that's the mandate we got from the founder of the Carlsberg, Mr. Jacobsen. Again, some of the core values of Carlsberg was so in the beginning and is so today, again showing his very close link to the science, both in natural science, humanities, social science. Many of his best friends and mentors were actually leading professors at Copenhagen University of his time here. So some of the core values today is quality and excellence, striving for perfection, semper ardent, meaning always burning, very strong coupling to science, innovation, and research, showing corporate social responsibility, also investing in great people. And he did so. Today, the Carlsberg Foundation is, besides every year handing out money for basic research, also responsible for running the Carlsberg Laboratory. We are responsible for running the National Museum at the Frederiksborg Castle here, and also for the Tuborg Foundation. In 1902, the new Carlsberg Foundation was established, which are handing out money for art in the Danish society here, but at the same time also responding for the Carlsberg Glyptotek. The link between the Royal Danish Academy and the Carlsberg Foundation was that the money or the letter from Mr. Jacobsen was given to the Royal Danish Academy. You could not have 200 professors from the Royal Danish Academy running the Carlsberg Foundation. So running the brewery, so a foundation was established where 5 professors are elected from the Royal Danish Academy to have run the daily business there. I'm happy to be one of them, and right now the chairman, and thereby also the chairman of the Carlsberg brewing industry here. And there's been a fantastic transition in the Carlsberg brewing industry here. We have seen a transition from being in the beginning, a local Danish brewing site to become more and more European. But if you look sort of just within the last 10 years, Carlsberg today is now a global brewery. It's the 4th largest brewery in the world here. We have a turnaround of 66 billion DKK. We have around 41,000 employees. We have a very strong footprint in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, mainly Russia, and a growing platform in Asia. So again, for a scientist like me, being chairman of that business here is also very challenging. But I think again, the philosophy of the Mr. Jacobsen himself was exactly that he would like to have hopefully smart people being responsible for running his brewing industry and not having only business people running it for optimizing the profit on the short term. So I think again that hopefully that illustrates to you a little bit about sort of the family of the Carlsberg Foundation here. Again, it's a very privilege every year to receive around 850 applications in October. Many of these money are giving back to young talent and people. Maybe some of them are in the audience here. Again, within the natural science, humanity and social science, many of the private foundations in Danish society are mainly giving money to the natural science. I'm very pleased that the Carlsberg Foundation is again sponsoring both the humanities, social science and natural science. Okay, so now we will have a small reception out there, and some of you will then get a chance to come in here and ask questions to Professor Labov. And of course, what will be served in the reception is, of course, a Carlsberg beer. So, please enter for the reception.